All right, ladies and gentlemen, you are locked on Falcons. I'm your host, Aaron Freeman, and today we are wrapping up our year in positional reviews, looking at the all important special teams, talking about the futures of Younghoe Koo, Thomas Morstead, and Pro Bowl long snapper Josh Harris, but more importantly, talking about the future of return specialist Cordarrelle Patterson and whether or not the Falcons should play hardball with their negotiations with him this offseason.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman. Been covering the Falcons for many years, formerly at FalcFans.com. RIP, still going strong on Twitter at FalcFans, and of course, the host of this preeminent Locked On Falcons podcast, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast, right here on the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. And before we get into today's year-end positional review of the all important special teams, it really does matter, folks. I do want to thank you guys for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available on a variety of podcast platforms, including Apple, Odyssey, Google, Spotify, and of course now on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel and give us a like when you do. So today we're wrapping up our year-end positional reviews where we've gone through the offense, we've gone through the defense, and now we've gotten to the most important phase of the game, special teams. And the reason why it's most important because the Falcons special teams was the best part of their team this year, particularly after a certain point in the season when they signed our Lord and Savior. That is, of course, Thomas Morstead. And for those of you that don't know, the Falcons were 23rd in DVOA, according to Football Outsiders this season, but in their weighted DVOA, which puts more value on late season play, the Falcons ranked ninth. And again, I don't know exactly where they were once they signed Thomas Morstead in week 12 ahead of that Jaguars game, but I can certainly say, looking at the numbers and comparing them to other teams that were among the top in the league in that weighted DVOA metric at the end of the season, I think the Falcons probably over the last 5 or 6 games of the season were probably in the top three, according to Football Outsiders special teams metrics. And we know Thomas Morstead had a great season, would have been on my Pro Bowl ballot if he was eligible to be on the ballot. He finished sixth in Pro Football Focus's punter rankings, although interesting enough, they were 14th during his time with the Falcons. They graded him out as an average punter, basically, in the 7 games that he played with the Falcons. And so we will dismiss PFF's heresy in this regard. They just have not been able to keep the faith when it comes to Thomas Morstead. But he was outstanding this season. He's also an impending free agent. So we'll get towards the end of today's episode, we'll talk about, the Falcons re-upping with him. But fellow impending free agent, this time a restricted free agent. We'll talk later about the difference between restricted and unrestricted free agency as it applies to Younghoe Koo, the Falcons kicker. We know he had an outstanding season. He was on my Pro Bowl ballot, was an alternate for the Pro Bowl team, was rated as PFF's. This time they were not being heretical with their grading of Younghoe Koo. He was their third highest graded kicker in the league this year on field goals. So we know he had a great season. Josh Harris was PFF's #1 rated long snapper, and he did legitimately make the Pro Bowl, due to his ability in coverage. And finally, after 9 years in the NFL, he got recognized for his greatness. And so all in all, the Falcons special teams, the core special teams players and the kicker, the punter, and long snapper all had outstanding seasons. All of these guys are free agents, Harris included. And so I think the Falcons really do need to go out there and, based off of how well this unit played down the stretch, and the fact that the Falcons don't really have a great offense, don't really have a great defense, and getting the edge in that special teams in that third phase that often gets overlooked, but not here on the Locked On Falcons podcast. But that third phase could be instrumental in this team, particularly against a much harder schedule where the margin for error probably is going to be a little bit slimmer than it was in 2021. So I think the Falcons should do whatever they can to retain all three of these players this offseason. I don't think there's any reason to sort of pinch pennies when it comes to some of these guys. And, you pay them what they're worth. And we'll get, at the end of today's episode, we'll get into what I kind of think some of these guys are worth. But, as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, there's still some areas of the special teams that we do need to talk about. We need to talk about the return game. We need to talk about the coverage units. And when we talk about the return game, there is another impending free agent, that is Cordarrelle Patterson. And I'm going to, don't want anybody to come for me, but my hot take of the day, as we're going to unpack as we continue today's Locked On Falcons, is that I think the Falcons probably should pinch pennies when it comes to re-signing Cordarrelle Patterson. I'll explain exactly why I think that, and why I don't think he's necessarily a priority re-signing, or at least as big a priority re-signing as some of the other Falcons impending free agents. And we'll get into all of that as we continue today's Locked On Falcons podcast, guys. But before we get there, I do want to plug the various other shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network, that if you're not ready to say goodbye to the 2021 NFL football season, of course, you can get the lowdown on the last game of the season by checking out Locked On Bengals, Locked On Rams, Locked On NFL, Peacock and Williamson all week long on the same podcast platforms that you are currently listening and or watching Locked On Falcons. And that being said, we know that the football season is now at its end, and some of you, again, may not be ready to let that go. But, just because football season is over doesn't mean that betting season is over, because betonline.net has got you locked on all season long in 2022. And, you got basketball, pro and college hoops are in full swing. And it's not just football. It's not just basketball, because at betonline.net is your number one source for hockey, boxing, UFC, even your favorite Vegas casino games. So go check out betonline.net. It's the best place for sports scores, podcasts, news, odds, total, player props, futures bets. If you want to be like yours truly and taking a bet on who's going to win the Super Bowl next year, you can do that, of course, at betonline.net. So head over to the website today, use your mobile device to sign up and learn more about the trends in action. BetOnline, where the game starts. So let's get into the Falcons' other aspects of the special teams, talking about the coverage units in the return game. We'll get to the Cordarrelle Patterson hot take in a moment, but let's talk a little bit about the Falcons' coverage units. And my only takeaway from the 2021 season is that two players that made some pivotal plays late in the season on the coverage units, Qadree Ollison forcing that fumble against the 49ers that should have set up a go-ahead touchdown early in that game. And then you had Avery Williams forcing a fumble on a punt return against the Bills that set up, resulted in a safety that helped boost the Falcons in that game. Two players that made some pivotal plays late in the season, but didn't really get that much action on special teams coverage throughout the year. And, all I want to say is, I think those guys need to get more opportunities. Ollison's interesting because when we drafted him back in 2019, one of the reasons why I talked about why I thought the Falcons drafted him was because of how effective and productive a special teams player he was in college at Pitt. And that, in comparison to a player that they drafted 2 years prior to that, in Brian Hill, that they wound up having to cut his rookie season because he didn't necessarily immediately carve out a role on special teams, because he didn't have that special teams experience during his college career at Wyoming. And yet, despite Ollison having that pedigree coming into the league, he hasn't really been a regular on the Falcons special teams unit. And I think that play where he forced that fumble against the 49ers is just a testament that he's a player that needs to get more production, I hope, or more opportunities. I hope he gets that in 2022 as part of the Falcons' regular special teams and coverage units. And Avery Williams was a player that we obviously know similarly was drafted because of how productive a special teams player he was at Boise State. He started out the season on the Falcons coverage units, tag teaming with Cordarrelle Patterson as the two primary gunners on the punt coverage units. But after that first month of the season, because Patterson basically graduated to being the team's RB1, and so therefore his role on coverage units was immediately removed. And Avery Williams, I think in part due to the injury to Isaiah Oliver being needed to play more on defense, didn't have as much a role on the gunner until very late in the season, until those last two games against the Bills and whatnot. And we saw him make a play, and it was like, my reaction to it was similar to Okoye in Infinity War, for you MCU stands that will get this reference, where she's like, why was she up there the whole time? And I'm like, with Avery Williams, like, why was he on the sideline the whole time on these punt coverage units when he could be making plays like that? And I have a similar sort of stance with Qadree Ollison. So those are my main takeaways from the coverage units this year. Hopefully those guys will be mainstays on the coverage units in 2022 that they weren't. Obviously, Avery Williams, in addition to, flashing on those coverage units late in the season, he was also the Falcons' primary punt returner throughout the season. And then after Patterson, due to injuries in the second half of the season, was limited as a kickoff returner, he sort of took over as the main regular guy. And he was very productive as a kickoff returner, much more productive than he was as a punt returner. That's Avery Williams, of course, we're talking about. And according to PFF, he was their number 2 highest graded kickoff returner in the league this past year. And meanwhile, he was pretty much an average punt returner based off of their grades. He was number 21 in that metric. And the only thing that's notable to me about the whole PFF grades was that the player that was the top graded punt returner in the league this year was Brandon Powell with the Rams, who just won a Super Bowl with that team. And it just continues the trend that started off a couple of years ago with Andre Roberts left Atlanta, where it seems like players that were punt returns for the Falcons are not particularly productive and then leave Atlanta and then become very productive for their next team. And it's just kind of like, why can't we do this? And speaking of that, that gets us to the hot take of the day, which is, I don't know if the Falcons should be making it that big a priority to re-sign Cordarrelle Patterson. Basically, I think the Falcons probably should be playing hardball when it comes to the contract negotiations with Cordarrelle Patterson. And I'm sure some of you are listening or watching and saying, okay, Aaron, that's not really that hot a take. Me and my friends have been talking about not keeping Cordarrelle Patterson for months. And it's like, okay, that's fair. We don't necessarily run in the same circles, but in the circles I run into, the conversation about Cordarrelle Patterson is not necessarily whether the Falcons should keep him. It's whether the Falcons can keep him. And I think the conversation kind of needs to be a little bit more. And that's kind of what I'm getting into today. And we won't necessarily fully unpack this, as we'll probably get deeper into this as we approach free agency. But I'm just going to lay the groundwork for now, that I think the conversation should be more about, should we re-sign Cordarrelle Patterson? And, that's probably funny coming from me because I'm a big believer in explosive plays. And we know that Cordarrelle Patterson was a big part of the explosive plays. He was the second most explosive playmaker for the Falcons when we're looking at those 20-plus yard plays that I put such an emphasis on. And so you would sit here and say, Aaron, you're sitting here saying that the Falcons should, the Falcons were already one of the 4 worst, least explosive offenses in the league, and you're taking away like 25% or 22% of their explosive plays that Cordarrelle Patterson was, and their second most explosive playmaker. That doesn't mesh with your philosophy, and you'd be right. But in doing research, it's kind of like Patterson's explosive plays. I think he had 10 20-plus yard plays this year. I think 9 of them came in like 5 games. That first Bucks game, the Giants game, the Washington game, the Jaguars game, and the Saints game. And then I think the only other big play he had was in the second Bucks game, where he had that big long run that set up this touchdown run by Mike Davis. But like outside of those 5 games, like you look at Cordarrelle Patterson's production in the other 11 games that he played, whether it was rushing or receiving, his production is pretty, again, it's not anything special. Like, again, those 5 games, he was incredible. Those 5 games, he was instrumental in helping the Falcons win 3 of those games, and certainly being in a position to win a 4th game against Washington. So it's not to sit here and say that Cordarrelle Patterson didn't have value this year. But the reality is, like, I don't know how much stock you can put on Cordarrelle Patterson having a repeat of those 5 games. And like when we talk about Cordarrelle Patterson hitting free agency, you're looking at sort of him, Russell Gage, and Foye Oluokun as the team's sort of top in-house free agents that are sort of the priorities to resign. And I'm sure everybody has various opinions on where the Falcons should prioritize those guys. And again, probably the conversations most of the people I talk to would probably put Patterson or Oluokun number 1 or number 2 on that list, and probably Russell Gage a distant 3rd on that list. But I kind of feel like Patterson should be the 3rd guy. And I feel like that, not to say that I don't think the Falcons should re-sign Cordarrelle Patterson. I just think of those 3 guys, like I would be, if I'm, Terry Fontenot and I'm his cap negotiator, I'm probably playing hardest ball with Cordarrelle Patterson when it comes to pinching pennies and scrimping and saving or whatever the case may be, because the way I kind of see it, like, of those 3 players, ask yourself the question, which player is more likely to be replaced by a third round draft pick that the Falcons could have this season? When you look at, Russell Gage, and we talked about this in our positional review of the wide receiver, that the production, the hit rate of finding rookie wide receivers and also free agent wide receivers that can outproduce what Russell Gage gave us this past season is pretty low. It's like 20 something percent, right? And so that's not a great hit rate that you're going to get a third round pick to come in and outproduce Russell Gage. And certainly there's not going to be a third round pick. It's not likely. Again, I don't know what the exact percentages are, but it doesn't seem likely that a third round pick is going to come in and outproduce Foye Oluokun and give you the 374 tackles or whatever he had this past season and be the leader of your defense and be the guy that can carry the green dot as that Mike linebacker in the middle of your defense. Doesn't seem likely that you're going to find that guy in the third round. But in terms of like Cordarrelle Patterson's production, particularly as a running back, yeah, like I feel like there's a very high hit rate, a very high percentage chance that a third round running back can come in here and give you at least 600, 700, if not 800 or more rushing yards this upcoming season right away. Now, you can certainly say that it's not just that, running back production that you're losing if you lose Cordarrelle Patterson, and you're absolutely right. And a rookie running back is probably not going to come in and give you the 500 plus receiving yards that Cordarrelle Patterson had. But I kind of look at it and say, when you're like, okay, yeah, Cordarrelle Patterson is definitely a unique and very gifted pass catcher, but it's not like there's a shortage of good receiving running backs that are going to be on the open market this offseason. There are plenty of guys that can certainly give you value in the screen game. There's not many guys that you're going to be able to line up outside and give you the production that Cordarrelle Patterson gave you, like we saw in that Washington game, like we saw in that Saints game, and whatever the case may be. So you are losing that, but I also kind of feel like you can probably replace that with a relatively cheap wide receiver that's going to give you a handful of those, big plays on fade balls or whatever the case may be. And so I just kind of look at it and I say, like, you're probably not going to get that all wrapped up into one player that you're getting in Cordarrelle Patterson, the running back, the outside wide receiver, the dynamic pass catcher, as well as the kickoff return guy. But I feel like you can probably realistically replace all three of those, or all four of those skill sets with, 3 or 4 players, and probably do it for much cheaper than you're probably going to wind up paying Cordarrelle Patterson, is kind of the point I'm trying to make. And I feel like all in all, like I can get comparable. I can get like 75% of what Cordarrelle Patterson is bringing to the table for probably like $3 or so million. And so therefore I kind of feel like you kind of have to set your price for Cordarrelle Patterson and be like maybe $4.5 million instead of the sort of $6, $7, $8 million I've seen various people throw around as potential price points for him. And I'm just like, you just kind of you set your price and you say, Cordarrelle, take it or leave it, or whatever the case may be. You're allowed to test the market. If you can get something better, then by all means, give us an opportunity to match it, because maybe he gets like 4.8 and you say, okay, like, yeah, we can go to 4.8 or whatever the case may be. But like, you let him test the market, and if he gets a better offer elsewhere, then you just say, oh, look, we feel like this role in our offense, even if it's spread out among 3 players, is only worth X amount of dollars. And so you let him test the market in that way. And that's kind of how I feel about it. Again, I'm not trying to sit here and make the case that the Falcons shouldn't re-sign Cordarrelle Patterson. I'm just trying to make the case that the Falcons should probably play a little bit harder ball when it comes to this negotiation, because it's just kind of the nature of the position that Cordarrelle Patterson now plays, which is running back, it's kind of a dime a dozen position. Wide receivers getting closer to being a dime a dozen position, but finding guys that can be productive, certainly right away in the NFL is not something that's easy to come by. And that was one of the things we talked about in a previous episode when we did the wide receiver year review. So that's kind of me explaining my hot take. Obviously, I'm sure, that will cause people in the comments to, either agree, disagree, or whatever the case may be. And again, this is a conversation that we can unpack and we can go into further detail as we get closer to free agency, when we really start to key in on what the Falcons should or should not do in free agency. But I'm just kind of laying the groundwork where I just haven't seen a whole lot of conversations about whether or not the Falcons should re-sign Cordarrelle Patterson. It's just really about, can they re-sign him? Can they afford him? Is he going to price himself out of Atlanta? All these various things, rather than like, I think, If he does, then so be it. Like, that price tag, I think, is just kind of worth X amount of dollars. And if he wants Y amount of dollars, then, good luck to you, Cordarrelle Patterson. But I feel like the Falcons should be really reasonably confident that they can get comparable value for basically the same amount of money that they paid Cordarrelle Patterson this past year, which was like $3 million. So that's kind of my hot take of the day. Do with it as you will, but we will wrap up today's episode by getting into, returning back to Thomas Morstead, Younghoe Koo, and Josh Harris, all guys that I don't think the Falcons should play hardball with, but we'll talk about what their potential price points could be as we wrap up today's year-end positional review of the Falcons special teams here on Locked On Falcons. But I want to thank you guys first for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. And I always have recommendations for what your second listen should be. And of course, why not check out any of the local shows here on the Locked On Podcast Network covering the Atlanta Hawks, Locked On Braves, Locked On Bulldogs, etc. And you can find all those shows on the same podcast platforms that you find Locked On Falcons, including Locked On Braves and Locked On Bulldogs, now free and available on YouTube. So today's episode is also brought to you by Rock Auto, because with ever increasing numbers of makes and models, it's now impossible for your local chain auto parts store to stock all the parts that you need. Why wait while the person behind the counter orders the parts on their computer when you already have access to rockauto.com at home or in your pocket? You can save time and money when using Rock Auto instead of spending up to twice as much for the same parts from a chain store or car dealership. Rock Auto is a family business serving do-it-yourselfers for over 20 years with reliably low prices for every customer. They have everything you could possibly need, from brake parts, tail lamps, motor oil, even new carpet. Go to rockauto.com right now and see all the parts available for your car or truck. And when you do, write Locked On in the How Did You Hear About Us box so that they know we sent you. Amazing selection, reliably low prices, all the parts your car will ever need. rockauto.com. So let's talk about these three main specialists and what the Falcons should do as they approach free agency. And I feel much more confident and comfortable that the Falcons will resign all three. And to be for the record, I do still feel optimistic that the Falcons can keep Cordarrelle Patterson. I just think they probably should be a little bit more frugal than probably most people think they should be. And part of the reason why I'm optimistic that they will resign Cordarrelle Patterson is because I don't think they'll be as frugal as I would be in that situation. My philosophy is hope for one thing, and then the Falcons will ultimately disappoint you and go and zig when you expect them to zag. But that's a conversation, again, that we'll unpack further for another day. But talking about the three other free agents hitting the market, Josh Harris, Thomas Morstead, and Younghoe Koo, I feel like Harris should be able to be relatively re-signed. We don't often see teams struggling to re-sign long snappers. And you look at, I think, a recent contract extension that the Chiefs gave to their long snapper this past November, who's roughly the same age as Josh Harris. It was like averaging about $1.35 million a year. And I feel like, the Falcons should be able to afford giving Harris a comparable, multi-year contract worth that amount. Maybe they can go lower than that and just basically up the amount of guaranteed money, as part of that deal, if they can. So I think they should be relatively easy to keep Josh Harris. There seems to be no signs that Josh Harris wants to leave Atlanta, and hopefully there's no signs that the Falcons want Josh Harris to leave Atlanta. And then you come to Thomas Morstead, who is getting up there in age. He's at around age 35. But I think there's no reason to think that if he wants to keep playing, that he couldn't play another 4 or 5 years. Now, I don't think the Falcons necessarily need to sign him to a 4 or 5 year contract. Maybe they sign him to a 2 or 3 year contract if if they don't want to give him a 1 year deal, if he wants a little bit more security than a 1 year deal, whatever the case may be. And again, I don't know exactly what that price tag is going to be, but typically punters of his caliber around his age have cap hits in between 1.5 and 2.5 million. So if that's like a 2 year, $5 million contract or a 2 year, $4 million contract or whatever the case may be, that feels right for Thomas Morstead at this point in time. So I feel like that's a good price point for him. As for Younghoe Koo, this is where it's going to be a little bit tougher because the price tag for kickers just went up a little bit because we've seen some new deals signed by kickers in the last 12 months. Guys like Daniel Carlson of the Raiders and Jason Sanders, I think, with the Dolphins. They got deals that were averaging around $4.5 million a year. And the difficulty with signing Younghoe Koo to a long-term contract as a restricted free agent, which is certainly an option that the Falcons could explore, is that kicker contracts typically aren't backloaded. And what that means is, typically, let's say you sign a 3-year contract worth $12 million a year, so average is $4 million a year. And the way that most people sort of look at these contracts and say, oh, your average $4 million a year, your cap hit's going to be 4 million, 4 million, 4 million for years 1, 2, and 3. But the way that teams typically backload contracts in the NFL is that instead of that being 4, 4, and 4, it's usually 2, 4, and 6. Like that's what it means where it's backloaded, where the contract goes up each and every year, and it's heavily weighted towards the end of the contract to being a higher sort of amount of money. But the way with kickers work is typically they don't have backloaded contracts. So it is much more likely to be that 4, 4, and 4 figure in the case of a kicker, or more accurately, it's probably going to be like 3.5, 4, and 4.5. And so because of that reason, I don't think the Falcons, if they sign Younghoe Koo to a sort of typical market deal for a kicker of his caliber, which would be in that $4.5 million range, I don't think it's going to save them all that much money than it would if they just wound up signing him to his restricted free agent tender. And let me explain how restricted free agency works. Typically what happens is that if your player is a restricted free agent, you choose to tender him at certain levels, right? And what happens is restricted free agents, like unrestricted free agents, are free to sign with other teams. But if a team tenders their restricted free agent, they have the right of first refusal. And what that means is, let's use Younghoe Koo in a hypothetical example. Let's say Younghoe Koo is tired of people like me confusing the real GSU and saying Georgia State is the real GSU rather than Georgia Southern. And he's tired of Falcon fans disrespecting him. He wants to go play for a place that really understands that the real GSU is Georgia Southern. Again, this is a hypothetical situation. Just go with me here, guys. And he says, I'm going to sign with the Colts. And the Colts are like, yeah, bring him on. We want Younghoe Koo. He'll be great for us. And let's say they sign him to like a 3-year, $12 million contract or whatever the case may be. Because he's a restricted free agent, like if he was an unrestricted free agent, he would just be a Colt that day once he signed the contract. But in restricted free agent, what that is, that contract is an offer sheet. And when you have the right of first refusal because you tendered a player, the Falcons basically have 7 days to match that contract. And if they do decide to match that contract after 7 days, then the Falcons will keep Younghoe Koo on a 3-year, $12 million deal. If they choose not to keep him, then he will sign with the Colts on a 3-year, $12 million deal. And the Colts will then owe the Falcons compensation in the form of a draft pick, which is determined by what his tender level is. And there's 3 different levels of tenders. There's the first round tender, there's the second round tender, and there's the original pick tender. And as you can probably guess, the first round tender, the compensation would be a first round pick. The second round tender, the compensation would be a second round pick. And the original pick tender is based off of when the player was originally drafted. So if Younghoe Koo was a 5th round pick, the Colts would owe him the Falcons a 5th round pick. But because Younghoe Koo is an undrafted free agent, the Colts would owe the Falcons nothing. Because he wasn't drafted. And so this is part of the reason why the Falcons almost certainly, when they do tender Younghoe Koo this offseason, are going to tender Younghoe Koo at the second round level, so that it basically prevents another team from signing him to an offer sheet and then basically the Falcons getting nothing in return. And they would be either forced to let him walk for nothing, or they have to match him at a contract they probably are not too comfortable with matching him at. So you're almost certainly guaranteed that Younghoe Koo will get the second round tender. So a team would have to give the Falcons a second round pick. And, outside of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, not many teams are willing to give up second round picks for a kicker. So it pretty much guarantees that no team is going to sign Younghoe Koo and he'll be back this year. But that second round tender is $3.986 million. So let's say $4 million. And again, if we're signing him to a multi-year contract that's averaging, say, $4.5 million or $4 million or whatever the case may be, then that first year salary is probably going to be somewhere around $3.5 million. So you're only really saving about $500,000 by signing him to a long-term contract. And so therefore, I don't really think it makes that much sense that the Falcons would feel compelled to sign Younghoe Koo to a multi-year contract rather than just giving him a 1-year tender and then having the opportunity, particularly in the 2023 offseason, where the Falcons should have considerably more cap space to pay Younghoe Koo the long-term contract that he's deserved. So I think you just give him basically that 1 year, $4 million contract. Again, maybe the Falcons could be creative with how they structure it. Maybe if they offer, to get into negotiations with Younghoe Koo, maybe they could get him to sign something considerably below market that, maybe is less than $4.5 million a year, but maybe it's like $3.75 million a year. Then I think the Falcons would be incentivized to sign him to a long-term contract. But outside of those circumstances, I just think the Falcons, there's not a whole lot of cap space that you're saving by trying to sign him to a long-term contract. So you just kind of give him the 1 year contract. And again, if you do give him the 1 year free agent tender at $4 million, you still have many, many months to negotiate a long-term contract that could wind up saving the Falcons more money if they need, that $500,000 or maybe $1 million in cap space at a later date. But I think probably the plan, at least initially, is to give Younghoe Koo that restricted free agent tender. So all that to explain, there's almost 0% chance that Younghoe Koo is walking this offseason, regardless of what the Falcons do. So he should be back in 2022. The question is going to be at some point in the next, let's say, 13 months, the Falcons are going to have to probably re-sign Younghoe Koo to a long-term contract. And I feel reasonably confident that will, go relatively smoothly at the point, at the opportune time when it comes. But I don't think the Falcons need to feel rushed to do that, in the next 6 weeks before free agency kicks off. So that's kind of where we'll leave it here, guys, with the Falcons special teams year in review. We are now done with reviewing the 2021 season. Of course, there's still a whole lot to talk about when it comes to free agency, whether we're talking about Patterson and some of these specialists, as well as so many other players like Oluokun and Russell Gage, et cetera. And we'll get into more of that as we get closer to, I think, March 16th is when free agency kicks off. So I guess 4 weeks away, not 6 weeks away. And so we'll just sort of have to see how that unfolds, and we still have more to come on upcoming episodes. We can probably do a Q&A if you guys want for tomorrow's episode. So if you want to send in your questions, you can do so via Twitter or Facebook at Locked On Falcons, via email at lockedonfalcons@mail.com. You can leave a comment here on the Locked On Falcons YouTube channel. So that's what we'll possibly and probably do on tomorrow's episode, answer some mailbag questions with some Wednesday wisdom, if you want to call it, to get that alliteration going. But no alliteration here, but I'll go ahead and plug with a really bad segue, the Locked On Bets podcast, where you can get handicapping expert Lee Sterling's daily picks as well as specials and lock a day. And just because football season over is not any indication that Lee is not going to have those, bet recommendations for you on the Locked On Bets podcast. And of course, you can find Locked On Bets on the same podcast platforms that you are currently listening to Locked On Falcons on. So guys, I appreciate it. Until then.